Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Glenn Underwood. So I am a local. My family, we own Twin Birches Cottages right up the line. And, this used to be Sunnybrook Acres, which, we have Steve Matt. There's so much local history that exists that, may never be uncovered. You may never discover it yourself. You may never see it. But a lot of it is kind of hidden in plain sight. So as I'm existing, as I'm growing up, I'm hiking Prospect Mountain, and I'm realizing, hey, this place is pretty cool, nice view, You would never know that someone used to own it. As you're, seeing the people camping at Hearthstone Point, you would never know that someone used to own that land. It's kind of like it's unseen. So I met my wife in 2006. We actually got married in 2008. And at Twin Birches Cottages, there's many relics of George Foster Peabody and his Abenia estate. I wasn't familiar at all with George Foster Peabody when I first started. I just thought, wow, cool fountain, And I have pictures of the fountain and all this before, but it's something where you get to looking at something and you say, wow, who built this? Who made it? Really interesting, but I had no idea. At Twin Birches Cottages, on the wall, we have this old picture, and it's of Price Manor. What's Price Manor? I thought, I don't know. I've never even heard of it. So I get on Google, I start looking, I try to find the history of the hotel, and my first intention was just, let me get the Twin Birches history. Let me put together a photograph album. Let me do something that the guests can see, And so I go through and I say, Price Manor, well, that's this guy, Walter Price. Okay. There's a little bit about him. He's an interesting guy. And then you can basically Google Abenia and you'll find, hey, Adolph Ochs, the publisher, the New York Times owner, just a wonderful Lake George figure. And then there's Peabody. He's kind of underneath. And I said, all right, who is this guy? I need to Google him. I need to figure this out. And so as I'm looking through and I'm saying, all right, Peabody, what can I learn? I discovered that there's the Yaddo files at the New York Public Library. What I didn't know is how much of the files there were. It is a tremendous amount of information. These are his personal files. Now, as I'm, I think I just turned 30 years old. I'm actually 40 right now. So about 10 years ago, I thought to myself, all right, well, I'm getting into this. I got to do it. I got to go to New York City. I got to really look through these files. And so, I drive down by myself. And I have two friends that live in the city, and they actually assisted me as research assistants, right? They're not research assistants. They're just my friends. But as I'm going down, I didn't know what I was looking for, but I knew Abenia. I knew hotel history, right? What I personally discovered was George Foster Peabody. And I'd like to share a lot of that with you. I wrote a book. I'll hold it up. I have a copy right here. So over the past 8 to 10 years, I put it together. This is my book. It's called Discovering George Foster Peabody. And it's 518 pages long. And so it did take quite a bit of time. It's professionally edited, professionally indexed, professionally graphic designed. And, a lot of the information I'm going to share today and more. I couldn't possibly share everything in just an hour. But what I'd like to do is go through, who Peabody was and what he was about. So let's start it. If it'll move. It did work. Oh. There it goes. All right, it's back. So here's a photo of George Foster Peabody, and he's actually crossing the Stebbins Brook. This is a small feeder of Lake George. It's right on the north end of Twin Birches. And one of the photographs that I opened up his photo album and I said, wow, hey, there he is. What a sharp-dressed guy crossing a brook, And it's kind of like, it's almost very telling of who he was. He's very proper. He's very kind of a stoic guy of sorts, but at the same time, here he is, the dynamic of his life. Here he is, kind of this proper guy in nature, which is what he loved. Let's talk about his early life. What I've done is I've laid out his family. Now, this is actually, I'm not going to stand over there, but this is a photograph of his actual family. This is from, they're actually outside of Yaddo in Saratoga. Every bit of his family, touched Lake George. They were here. George Foster Peabody was born in 1852. He's born in Columbus, Georgia. The Deep South. His father was a merchant. Basically had we'll call it a hardware store, something maybe a little bit bigger than an Ace would be, And so 1865, your Civil War is kind of coming to an end. And, Columbus, Georgia, it was basically a strong point for the South, albeit, very South. Actually, the Civil War had ended. The surrender at Appomattox had already happened. And then after the fact, the Battle of Columbus happened. They burned Columbus to the ground, essentially. And throughout that process, Peabody's life is devastated. What I'll tell you about him is that he grew up with relatively little education to begin with. His mother more or less homeschooled him. And that was really influential in his life. Until 10 years old, he was homeschooled. And so there's his mother, Elvira. These are his two brothers, Charles Jones Peabody, Royal Canfield Peabody. Now, he did have a sister that died young, but this is the core of his family. This is the core of him growing up. Also his father. I wasn't able to find a photograph of his father, and this is part of history too, is, I recommend it to everyone. Write the names on the back of your photographs. Write the dates on the back of your photographs. It's so important for the future. And so, as he's growing up, let's talk about his schooling just a little bit. So he goes to a private school for maybe 2 years, has to move essentially due to the end of the Civil War, moves up to Connecticut, so the first time he moved north. And then right after that, he goes to, it's called the Deer Hill Institute in Connecticut, right? Right after that, and that lasted maybe about 6 months. They couldn't afford it anymore. Their family is basically financially ruined. They moved to Brooklyn. They open up their house to tenants. And they essentially become like I'm not going to call it a boarding house, but something of that sort. As their family had that store in Columbus, I don't know that they were ever high society, but I do know that they were actually, prosperous. After the fact, not so much. So this is not a guy that grew up with a silver spoon per se. He kind of came from this troublesome, story. When we're talking about his education too, like I said, he's homeschooled. He moves up from that with very little schooling and self-educates himself. At night, he would go to the Brooklyn YMCA after he moved to Brooklyn, and as a younger man, read all the books he could possibly read. Very, very much just into education, into knowing every little bit of every little thing. Very inquisitive guy. And so we'll talk about his early friendships. I don't know why the slides are a little off, but let's fix that. Hey, all right, now we're talking. So, especially as I want to kind of describe the root of it all, especially today. Who was he to Lake George? Who was he to here? These are the most prominent friendships that essentially kind of encompass his Lake George experience. Now, Edward Moore Shepard, Edward is a guy that basically came to Lake George as a younger man. Before, you may have heard of Earl o' West, that was his estate. Before Earl o' West, he rented a house for probably about 10 years. But before that, he came here as a younger man. He would camp out, and they would have I forget exactly the islands, but it was more or less his college fraternity. They would have this almost like a fraternity weekend. He'd camp on the islands as a child. And there's many stories, and actually, the story is in my book, of how he came to Lake George when he was younger and just fell in love with it. So Edward Moore Shepard is basically the root of Lake George. Like as he came here, as he established, built Earl of West, it's something where George Foster Peabody, he didn't have that estate upstate. He didn't have that. He did have Yaddo and Saratoga. Now this was Spencer Trask and Katrina Nichols. Spencer Trask and Katrina Trask later, but she was Kate Nichols before that. They all met as in Brooklyn, actually, and this is at church. They basically established their early friendships and grew to be lifelong friends. That really never changed in their lives. And so here's more or less unseen photographs. Some of them have been, circulating online. Most of them haven't. So a lot of this is new material that, quite honestly, many people haven't seen unless you've read the book. And so, you have Spencer Trask and Katrina Trask. Then you have George Foster Peabody. This is at Yaddo. This is in Saratoga. Once again, George Foster Peabody and Katrina Trask all your way to your right. And here's a photograph that is pretty special. And like I said, outside of the book, you're the first people to see it. It was kind of hidden away in those Yaddo files. And it really is kind of telling, there's an aspect of George Foster Peabody where he was such a partner to the Trasks, a dynamic triage, I'm going to call it. And, you could say he's their third wheel. You could, your mind can go in different places if you're educated and you've read about the Trasks and this and that, but they very much did everything together. They were very much like just this super group of people. Eventually, later in life, after Spencer's death, Peabody would marry Katrina. This is something that I believe in all of it. He loved her more than anything. And there's multiple, like say in the files that I've recovered, multiple, I'm gonna call them love letters. I mean, if someone sent it to my wife, I'd be like, whoa, okay, very, very, very juicy for the times. But it was never of a overbearing material. It was just, it was showering in compliments and very, I don't know how to say it, very like, just romantic in the sense of what romantic writing could be. Well, we've come. This thing doesn't want to stay put here. Let's try to get it back on track. So, as a businessman, which is, I believe, pretty important to understand who he was before he came to Lake George. So, in business, he started as a young kid, actually. He started at 13 years old in the dry good business. He's more or less, he starts as just kind of like I'll just call him a helper. He's not skilled, he's not this or that, but he did have a knack for numbers, and that was respected through business. So he found a way to project himself, this trajectory, I'll say, into better positions within business. And while maintaining his friendships with, say, Spencer Trask, who came from more or less a prominent family, who was already into banking and this and that. And Spencer kind of brought him up in that banking world. And so here we have it in 1879. This is a real dialogue that happened between the two of them. Spencer said, "Hey, George, come on, work for me, man. It's time, right?" And this is exactly what Peabody said to him. "Spencer, I'm in love with your wife." He said he basically refused and said, "Hey, I'm not able to join you, man. I can't be doing that. I love your wife." And Spencer's reply, "I don't blame you, Foster. I'm in love with her myself." Now that's really like one of those moments where that shows their friendship. It's like, yeah, okay, buddy, come on. You're still going to be part of this. We know, right? So as we kind of talk about what that is, these guys were very like, they're together, but also had different aspects of what they cared about. It's almost like between the Trasks, Peabody, Shepard, their greater circle, they would pick something to kind of hone in on and then expand upon it. But in business, this is what happened after the fact. January of 1880, Peabody accepts the position with Spencer. goes to work for him. It's called Trask and Stone at first, then it's called Spencer Trask and Company. George Foster Peabody is an absolute partner with Spencer. So after it's restructured, Peabody buys his own seat at the New York Stock Exchange. $24,000, that was a lot of money back then. And so here's a list of business that more or less, it would take any one of us a lifetime to even have one of those, member of the New York Stock Exchange is nothing to balk at, but here he is, deputy chairman and director of the Federal Reserve when that first started for many years. Talking about Spencer Trask and Company, Edison Electric, combustion engineering. These are giant corporations. When General Electric Company was basically first merged, Spencer Trask and Company was absolutely part of that merger. They're more than in it. Every railroad that he's part of, it's just like tremendous. I guess it doesn't want to stay put. It's just going to keep. It's going to keep pushing. But so a lot of railroad operations, a lot of mining operations, American beet sugar. I would say the majority of his money came from railroading and electricity. Early investor in Thomas Edison. So here we have an exact quote from Edison. In 1931, while George Foster Peabody was visiting Thomas Edison in his Florida home, Edison told his wife, "Here is the man who loaned me $10,000 at a critical period." Trask and Peabody were investors in the early light bulb experiments. They're investors in Thomas Edison when Edison Company wasn't the Edison Company. They absolutely built that as it grew. They were a huge, huge part of it. As I mentioned earlier, the General Electric, merger as that happened, George Foster Peabody's on the board of directors. My slideshow is, if you basically just have to push it up a little bit.
I'll try it.
It's okay.
Always you more than us.
Yes. I'm going to start ignoring it. But here, this is a photograph, and this is what I love about history, is as you come across something like this, in my mind, I just want to know, who are these people, And you start to come up with names, and you have, right in the middle, this is Lord Kelvin. There's a unit of measurement in heat that's named after this guy. George Foster Peabody is right over here. You have Spencer Trask right in the middle. And this, I believe, would be Charles Peabody, George's brother. And right over here, you have Charles Steinmetz, right? Charles Steinmetz, basically the godfather of electrical engineering. So we're talking about prominent people of their day. This is no cast of characters that are, slouching or anything. It's made up of, prominent bankers, prominent members of General Electric, and as they grew in business, this is the early workings of what we have. I mean, electricity, man, that changed our lives. So this is an example of the largest deal that Peabody ever made in business. $21 million of Edison Company stock that was basically transferred. Here's a guy that's entrusted to oversee stuff like that. In his banking career, this wasn't unusual, but it was the largest one. Here you have a photograph of Spencer Trask Company. You have Spencer. Well, thank you so much. Here you have Spencer. Here you have George. This would be George's brother Charles. This would be Mr. Bulkley. This would be 10 Wall Street, New York City. This is the height of their banking, and this is their office. And like I said, rare photographs. These are not published online. They're not everywhere. These are in the Yaddo files down in Manhattan. In government, once again, no short list of achievement. Peabody's more or less a lifelong Democrat. Never took a governmental position. Never took office. Everyone always urged him to, based on his his growth and his trajectory of who he was and what he accomplished, he was referred to as a statesman without portfolio. Here's a guy that befriended many, many influential, prominent government officials just based on who he was and what he was about. And so when you look at it, treasurer of the Democratic National Committee, no small job. And then basically when you look down, it's like, how many commissions? Now take into consideration, I've already showed you the business aspect. Once again, all these things, this would take us 10 lifetimes to be part of any of this. Very, very busy guy. And it's in my mind, as I'm starting to go through and see all these clubs and associations and chairmanships, I'm thinking to myself, like, this is the guy. This is how much could one man possibly do? And if we'll say this at the end of our day, you may have a obituary or eulogy. How many things will be listed? I hope that good person is my first one. But I look at it and I see just a man who accomplished a lot during his life. Some of his prominent friendships, and these translated to real life accomplishments. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and I go at length in the book about this. Peabody introduced Roosevelt to Warm Springs, Georgia. They're very much affiliated in politics before this. Roosevelt, we'll say this, it's clear that he was paralyzed. It was more or less like, they called it polio. It's debated now what it actually was, but we'll say this. Huge proponent of infantile paralysis. Warm Springs, Georgia led to, the Salk experiments, polio vaccine. We're talking about, crippling disease that totally is eradicated just by movement, right? But secondly, this friendship leads to the Saratoga Spa. Peabody, a giant proponent of the spa, a giant proponent of Saratoga. And, for today's sake, I want to talk about Lake George, but the second half of the book is all Saratoga Springs and his movement down there. It's such a wonderful thing of what they could accomplish together. But his friendship with Roosevelt was massive. Same thing. This is a postcard. It's from Woolley, and here you have Charles Evans Hughes at Silver Bay. You have George Foster Peabody right next to him. There's a series of postcards. Essentially, Hughes gets on Peabody's Pocahontas boat. That was the name of his boat. They go to Silver Bay, and more or less like they're friends. I have correspondence between them. I have, and actually when Adolph Oxted owned Abenia, you have, it's more or less a guest book. And there's a luncheon and it just says, Charles Evans Hughes, George Foster Peabody, Adolph Ox. And I'm reading it and I'm like, geez, put me there. I want to be like the fly on the wall. What is the conversations, But we're talking about, Governor of New York State, Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. These are among Peabody's people. Herbert Lehman, he was the governor of New York State. Here's Peabody right next to him. This is during the Saratoga Spa dedication ceremony. A pile of correspondence between the two. Just as I'm going through and I'm looking up, who's Peabody? Who did he know? Many governors. There's like a track of maybe 10 different governors. President-wise, we're talking about Peabody being friends with Theodore Roosevelt, Grover Cleveland, Woodrow Wilson, FDR, and not just, I know that guy, as a little kid would say, yeah, he's my best friend, These people are absolutely corresponding and influencing each other. To talk more about who Peabody was, his dedication to education, he was a large philanthropist. He was a giving person. I guess you would say an altruist.
Another
we're rolling with it. Very much. The list of things that he was a part of are massive. And, looking at the trusteeships of all the different colleges and this and that, he's giving, you'll see on the next slide, he's giving not only a large amount of money to a lot of these causes, he's giving his time. Because he rose so prominently in business, in wealth and this and that, and in politics, he's in these circles. And I think any one of us could sit around and say, hey, what have I done, or what am I doing with my life? What have I done for anybody? And Peabody sat there and was so motivated to say, hey, who can I help? And he's a very religious person, and he believed in different aspects, different verses, and one of them is that essentially the chiefest among you should be the one who gives the all. And I'm not sure what verse it is, but at the same time, this is something that he believed. He just believed as he grew to be more prominent, he should give more. And that was his mantra. He was absolutely that. So to talk about education, a large proponent of African American education in an era where it really was not happening, and to move forward. So thank you so much. These are some of the larger donations that he made. I made and this is like research where I'm like, oh wow, hey, I found this news article and it has one thing he gave. And so as I'm starting to put it together, I'm realizing wow, these are massive, large amounts of money, especially if you adjust for inflation. We're talking about serious financial commitments. Here's a guy that just believed in it. And so his largest givings were definitely to the University of Georgia. But as you go down the line, it's like he's just giving. But then he goes back to his roots, YMCA. He called it his alma mater. This is my place. This is where I learned. This was my college, And not only is he giving large amounts of money to, towards YMCAs, I would say all over the country based on how they're kind of spread out. He's building some of the first African-American YMCAs that ever existed. This is an era where many people, especially in the South, aren't giving much of anything towards that. Here's a giving person, builds an African-American YMCA in Columbus, Georgia, and also one in Brooklyn. So very, very giving. Here he is with the Board of Trustees at Hampton Institute. In all these educational institutions in the South, not only is he just a trustee, he's a treasurer. And some of that's lifelong. He's part of not only the Southern Education Board and the General Education Board. These are educational groups that basically decided what education was for many years. It's Rockefeller funded. They started right around the early 1900s. There is information about that in the book, and there is more information online too. But what's interesting to note is the Southern Education Board, they would have an annual, I'm going to call it an annual meeting, where they would get together, they would discuss what's happening next for this year. That was at Abenia every year, multiple years in a row. And so, as we're sitting here in little old Lake George, there's a meeting that's happening, 2 miles up the road that's changing the face of half the country. And then with the General Education Board, which flowed right into it, they're changing what education is in the entire country. So the grassroots of what happened here, expands everywhere. And there are examples of that I did include the book, the eradication of hookworm in the South and different things that they would sit there and talk about. It's almost like a meeting of the minds. This is something that I thought was really important. Through his educational philanthropy, Peabody involved himself, in different circles. Booker T. Washington, a prominent proponent of industrial education for African Americans in the South with Tuskegee Institute. Peabody absolutely involved himself in these causes. with Booker T. Washington, and as you'll know, you'll say right there, Hollis for sale. This is Hampton Institute, this is Tuskegee, and this is Peabody. And basically, Anna T. Jeans, she's a Quaker woman. As she's getting older, and she gave a lot during her lifetime. But basically, these three men went to her. She was interested in setting up more or less a foundation to teach African American teachers to teach. And if you read it, after Peabody thanked her for the generous donations, she said that he did not need her, but she should thank him. It's almost like just a true trade. And then what I thought was really just wonderful is as you're going through, it's after it's established and highly successful, by 1910, and this is not we're talking about 3 years after it started, 129 teachers. So it's really a kind of a program that's pushing forward, not only education but educators. So I think that's really, it's really wonderful. Now Penn School, yet another African American educational school down south in South Carolina. Here you'd have George Foster Peabody, but you'd also have John Howard Mellish. One of Peabody's friends and more or less Lake George associates, and they did quite a bit together. And yet again, a lot of that information is in the book. But something to take note of is with Penn School, they would essentially Peabody. How do I describe this? Peabody himself believed that with philanthropy you have to have donors, right? And so the people that ran it, and this would be Grace House and Rosa Cooley would be their names. Peabody said, okay, well, let me put them in a house in Lake George, and then they can fundraise and they can involve themselves in the Lake George circles, and they can gain benefactors from this. They can move forward with this. So exactly where that is used to be the Hill of Happiness, which is right up the road. And Peabody had a cottage on the left that was called Minantio. There's a cottage on the right, lower, that was right next to the road. Now this has been leveled probably about 4 or 5 years ago. But right next to the road, there was a house, and it was called Okeana. And this is where the, house in Cooley, this is where they lived in the summertime. And, this would be a picture of Okeana from the side. But as many of you, if you do remember, it was right next to the road. And so to talk about women's suffrage, a huge proponent of this in an era where there's a big divide, even among men, among women. Here's Peabody, especially in, I would say, 1909, right on through. He really grabs hold of it and says, this is messed up. This needs to change. He joined prominent suffragists of his day. He, among others, started the Men's League for Women's Suffrage, and he was the president of that. So not a bystander. He's not sitting by and letting things happen. He absolutely involves himself with it. He goes to Albany, and if you're familiar with women's suffrage, this is no short list of names. I mean, these are prominent suffragists. And here's George Foster Peabody in front of the state. We should no longer rest with claiming to be democratic, but should go forward at once to the goal of really universal suffrage. I mean, that's potent. That's more than most would say in their day, especially in front of the government. Yet another quote, and this is later on. It was not a short battle. This was a long-term thing. I thought this quote was really relevant too. It is of the utmost consequence, therefore, that this year, 1917, shall signalize the advance of New York State by granting women their inherent right to say their full conviction as to the government by having equal voting rights with the men. Boom. I just, you can't say anything more. Here's a guy that just stood up for it and wasn't shy about it. very much made his positions known. He was also a large advocate of peace. Here he is at the National Arbitration and Peace Conference. This was hosted by Andrew Carnegie. He would be right here sitting next to Booker T. Washington. Once again, just the movements that he attached himself to, he was very, very into. This is an interesting one, and this was like, I came across all of this by chance. There's the Peabody Awards, which you may have heard of or maybe not. This is the University of Georgia basically gives them out every year for excellence in journalism. This predates the actual Peabody Awards with the Peabody Award, So I thought that was interesting. It's the Peabody Peace Medal. He essentially, reached out to local colleges, local institutions, local schools, and said, hey, and actually not even local, kind of across a wide variety of them, and said, hey, have your students write an essay dedicated to peace, and we'll be awarding these medals. And these are in the 1930s. This predates, like I said, the actual Peabody Awards that came about in the 1940s. And so, the actual face of that design, here you have Evelyn Beatrice Longman. She worked under Daniel Chester French, but she's also she involved herself with this is the Lincoln Monument. This is like, no small sculptress. Like this was actually the face of the original Peabody Award also that happened in the 1940s. And this back, which is more rare, blessed are the peacemakers. I love that. I think that's so interesting. And so, like anything, once you involve yourself with some sort of history, it's like, oh man, I got to get this. So I actually bought this on eBay. I own this, and it hard to find. It's very rare, but more or less, like, how interesting is it that here's a guy that not only stands for peace, but he's rewarding people that get their mind working about what it is. So now we're going to kind of segue into Lake George. You have a baseline of who he was, what he did. I'd like to talk about Abenia. This was his Lake George estate. And, when you talk about Abenia, you kind of have to backtrack into what it was and then what it is. And so property-wise, as it started, there is prehistory, but we'll talk about millionaires' history. Here you have Walter Price. He's a New York City, he's a brewer. Kind of an interesting character. If you read about him, he's not the most liked figure in Lake George history. I included a bit of history about him in my book. I did him some service. He's a very interesting guy. But he built Price Manor. We're talking about 1869. And I'll show you photographs of what Price Manor was and what it became. What it did become was Abenia. It's the same exact property. It's the same exact mansion. And so when you're going through history, I've realized this so many times. It's almost like you're throwing information at someone, they'll throw it back, and then you can realize what it is in between it all. Now, George Foster Peabody coming to Lake George is often retold and retold and retold that he came here. It's 1891. That's when he bought Abenia. That's when it was, and it's actually incorrect. Warren County property records and every bit of history would tell me 1899. And part of that is it's no fault of anyone's. It was published in the 1950s. It's recited ever since. But deeper research, which is, now is this era, and this is why I'm able to even do this. The internet is such a resource with newspapers.com and Fulton History and different periodical websites where you can actually go through and you can read the old papers and see what it was. But looking through his documents, so 1899 is when he came to Lake George and bought Abenia. So Walter Price, 1869, it's ready by 1870. He dies in 1876. So really didn't get to enjoy what Price Manor was. So here's a photograph. This is by Stoddard. This is, Price Manor. basically, stately. Now, you would assume that as a brewer, he wouldn't have that kind of dough, to put up something like this. He was a bit of, he kind of ran with the Tammany Hall crowd, and at one point, Walter Price was actually the president of the Board of Excise, the liquor tax, but he was also a brewer. So there's a little, there's a little something funny about this guy. But he was basically in that Boss Tweed ring with Tammany Hall. Aoki Hall, the mayor of New York City, was also one of Price's pallbearers after he passed away. But the prominence of Price Manor was definitely prominent. And so yet, the next probably 5 or 6 slides, these are of Price Manor and what it was. These are Seneca Ray Stoddard photographs. And so of this, this mansion is surely no longer, this garage or carriage house is surely still there. And so multiple, it's funny, I was talking to someone and they said, oh, those plaster statues that were, I've seen those photos, those plaster statues. And I said, well, they're Italian marble is what I've researched and found, but really just wild stuff. Really just interesting. So as I told you, Walter Price, he'd actually passed away, more or less earlier, kind of earlier on into his Price Manor estate. His daughter took over. She held on to the property for probably about, if I had to say in my mind, it's probably about, 20 or so years. She sold it to, it would be the Bike family, BYC. I may be pronouncing that wrong, but this is the property, this is Price Manor as Peabody first saw it. This is from his personal photographs, for sale or to let. Big for sale sign right up out front. So the Price Manor that it was, that was what Peabody purchased. That was exactly this. Here is a picture of the Peabody family in Lake George in 1891. So this is also where history kind of gets a little funny. I first saw this photograph and I said, there it is, the smoking gun, George Foster Peabody right there. And what I realized after I went through and actually very much dissected it is that his brother Royal looks just like him, like a dead match. The beard is perfect and they're very much the same exact kind of figure. I looked through this entire photo album and I said, wow, I see Royal, and I assume that because here's his wife and here's what it is, but I actually I was not able to make out George in any of these photographs. However, this is the Peabody family, and in the book it's actually listed, who is who. Now, to move into Abenia, after he purchased it, he completely redid the entire Price Manor. It completely changed. We're talking about an overgrown property. We're talking about neglect. Here's something where he goes through and every bit of it he just touches and makes his own. So the next bit of photographs I'm gonna kind of push. It talks about the property, but it also will go inside of what Abenia was, which is rare and unseen. So here's Abenia circa 1900. This is after Peabody purchased it. He did make some slight, I'm going to call them additions. On the 3rd story, he actually put like I'm going to call it a panoramic room. And other than that, you can see it's kind of moving from he took the bird cage off the top. It's moving from like a Victorian style house to, something that's a little more, I don't know if you'd say it's more modern, but more of his style. And so there's a photograph from that exact room. So just to backtrack, from right here is right here. And, you're talking about a perfect panorama of Lake George. This is on the 3rd story of his house. You're pretty far up there. This is up there. So here you have Abenia itself. And by 1905, you can see the significant changes that he made. it's not just a fresh coat of paint. I mean, he really changed it all. And one of the things I always thought was interesting about the 1905 Abenia, being completed is right prominent, right in the middle, is the fountain, and where that sits there is exactly where it sits today. That hasn't moved at all as far as left or right. It's there. It's been refurbed and rehabbed and this and that, changed a little bit as far as landscaping goes, but it sits in the same exact spot. I know some of you are familiar with Twin Birches or what Sunnybrook Acres, was back then. It never moved throughout that whole, hotelers era. It still is in the same exact spot as the Millionaires era. And so now to kind of walk around, here you have the front porch of Abenia. You can see in relation to where the fountain was. Nowadays, this is just a big giant field. It's our front lawn. It looks really nice. It's wide and open. And like I said, it's landscaped around it. But to imagine, if you've ever seen the fountain, to imagine a giant mansion behind it is whoa, oh man, how could it possibly be there, But it absolutely was. And so here you have the Peabody family on the porch. You'd have his mother right here, his two brothers, their spouses, their children. This was his world. And you'll see later, they all had their houses in Lake George. I'll go into that later. This is his mother, Elvira. It's been said many times, and it's true. She was more or less the matriarch of the family. She was the hostess of the house. Even when Peabody lived in Brooklyn, I'm going to call him a perma-bachelor. Besides marrying Katrina Trask later in life, here was George Foster Peabody, more or less a bachelor. And as he's away, he would go out west on railroading trips, and here's Elvira, holding it down. We'll say, she is the matriarch, and so I thought it was wonderful to see her, on the porch of Abenia, and especially in his photo albums, it's in that era, it's rare that people come up 20 times, so there's not many photographs of her. But I thought this was wonderful. And so here you have the fountain that I mentioned in 1905. This is the same exact fountain that you can see in the Walter Price era. This is a sculptor by the Italian marble sculptorist Benzoni. And this was J.W. Fisk. It was like an iron foundry down in the city. And actually, it's a little different. This is the rendering on their, I don't know if you call it a booklet, essentially, but on the back of their booklet, it has this rendering of the fountain. And this was like a smoking gun to me as I'm trying to piece it all together. I'm like, wow, hey, look at this. It has the same swans, a little different. And actually, I was able to, as we were doing a little restoration work on the fountain, I was able to find the exact molds. There's a foundry down in, I believe it's Alabama, and they actually cast brand new swans of the same exact mold from the original. So I thought that was really interesting. And so here we have our man, right at the fountain, George Foster Peabody himself. And same thing, as we'll just say 2017, the first time that I went to New York City to the Yaddo files, I did not know what I was going to find in these files. Like, I just thought maybe something, I didn't even know I was going to find photographs. And as I'm going through and looking through his volumes, I mean, this sticks out to me because it's like, there he is, and wow, what an impressive kind of like, hey, am I going to find anything with him placed at Abenia, and what I'm finding is so much of that. So now we're going to go inside Abenia. This is kind of interesting because, like I said, outside the book, these are not published photographs, so it is very rare. So this is the front hall as you walk through the front door. As I first saw this, I said, wow, it's kind of cluttery, there's a lot going on here, but it's very much, he's a collector of art, he's a collector of paintings. Some of these things, you have a grandfather clock. This is a Tiffany clock. Spencer Trask actually gifted it to him This is at Yaddo now, and through correspondence, I realized this exact Tiffany clock. I believe he left it for the Ox family as they purchased Abenia, that was in 1914 when the Ox. So Peabody had sold Abenia. We'll get to that, but more or less he left not a majority of his things, but he did leave things for them. And Iphigene Salzburger, Adolf Ox's daughter, she had actually donated that clock to the Corporation of Yaddo, which I thought was wonderful. It's kind of a full circle thing. And as I said before, the presentation today is Lake George based. There's half of the book is Saratoga based. So there's a lot of Yaddo information. There's a lot of Saratoga Spa information that I've researched and wrote out. So a lot of that's included there too. But to go through Abenia, it's just pretty wonderful. I don't know. If the halls could talk, if you could be a fly on the wall in that era, that's what I believe. And some of these things are in museums now. This sculpture itself is in a museum in Brooklyn. I believe this painting right here is at Yaddo still. There's our man. But I always thought this was interesting too, because he keeps his world of finance and at some point, educational philanthropy, he keeps on going. And the thing that I realized is that as he moved to Lake George, he became a citizen of Lake George. He moved from Brooklyn to here. He still had activities in New York City. He still had activities in Brooklyn. He still had activities all over the country. But he made Lake George his home. And I think that, his desk is kind of that is kind of a clear picture of who he was, This man wrote some letters. I mean, it's wild how much correspondence there is and the treasure trove of information that's in all that. But if you can imagine, here he is absolutely staying connected to the outside, we'll call it the outside world, while he's kind of, I'm going to say nestled in his summer seat, but it became his year-round seat. He made here his thing. So yep, more photographs of the reception room. Different aspects of his house, and just walking through, it's like, and so this is interesting to note, and this kind of pulls it all together too. Now at Twin Birches, we have a rental unit, and we call it the Lakeview home now. Back in the Sunnybrook days, it was called the Keene Castle. What's interesting is, and this is like I said, the little shred of evidence from the past can spark something so potent. I'm in what I call the big house, and these exact windows are in the big house, and I'm like, where do these stained glass windows come from? What is this? What is this even about? And the bigger question is, as I'm seeing, these photographs, we'll say, to jump around a little, as I'm seeing this, for the first time, I said, there they are. That's the windows, And then my second thought was, seeing it like this. This was George Foster Peabody's dining room. My second thought was, man, look at these windows in his dining room. That's crazy. But that's not the Lakeview home. That's not Keene Castle. That's not what I know. How did the window move from here to there? And that's kind of a bigger question in history is, who knows, right? And what I believe is talking to people, and it's not a short process, opening your mind and saying, hey, what do you know about that? Or listen, you got to talk to this guy. Those are the things that open up the doors to history. And so as I'm going through, I'm realizing, these are from there. I actually, and I'll talk about it now because it's relevant. There's always a big question as I'm reading, as I became interested in this. I got The Great and the Gracious book, wonderful book. I got, William Gates's Millionaire's Row book, wonderful book. the two pillars of inspiration for the Millionaire's Row on Lake George. It really is the building block that without those publications, my publication wouldn't even, know where to start. So I forget exactly what year, but I went to the Chronicle Book Fair and I talked to William Gates, and I said, hey, I've always wondered this, what about the mansion at Abenia? What happened to that? What do you know about it? And because Great and the Gracious says one thing, he kind of, he looks, at me and he says, I couldn't really figure it out. He says, they set a great fire. I don't know. And so he says, there's a woman in Bolton Landing, Jane Gabriels. She would know. Sharp as a tack, and she will know. And so, does anyone know Jane? Have you ever? Yep. She was wonderful, and she was sharp as a tack. And so I was maybe 32. It was maybe 8 years ago. And so I said, man, I'm 32. Jane she was maybe about 90. And I said, how does a 32-year-old man just cold call a 90-year-old woman? And it's not a scam, Sounds like a scam to me, So what I did was I wrote her a letter, and I put a survey in there. And I wrote all my information, and I mailed the letter. And about 6 days later, I get a voicemail. It says, hey, Glenn, I don't know why you didn't just call me, I'm like, I don't know. But so it was really interesting. So I talked to Jane, and her father was Peter Kiernan. He was an insurance salesman. He was out of Albany. They had their Lake George house. This was right next to the Sagamore on the same island. And after the Ox family, Adolph Ox and his wife had passed away, Iphigene and her husband Arthur, they're in charge of the estate, and they're looking to auction it off. And her father won the auction. As more or less a favor to them, he put in a bid where nobody was actually bidding. And so Peter Kiernan, Jane Gabriel's father, had won the auction to Abenia. He purchased Abenia. She said, this is not our new house. This was just an investment. It was just for that. And so here's what happens. And I have the exact figures, written down in the book, but he wins it for a smaller sum of money, like not negligible, but not large. And of course, it's Abenia, it's this large, prominent property. And so what happens is the tax assessor comes in and says, oh, well, I think that's assessed at probably $100,000. And he says, well, I only won it for, I believe it was somewhere around 20 or 23. And he says, I only paid a fraction of that. What do I do? That's not going to work. So there's this kind of headbutting for a while. And Peter Kiernan says, well, if I level the mansion, of course the property goes down in value. And he raises the mansion. So that is the true story of what happened to the Abenia mansion. There was no great fire, although there's been fires on the property. The actual mansion itself was raised by Peter Kiernan. This is pre-Stony Brook era. This is, two owners before this. And so what Peter Kiernan, but she said, my father always thought there should be a nice house on the property. And so as I've come to know, he took the windows, and there's other doors and stuff like that, and he put this exact window in that Keene Castle, in that big house. So that's how it went from point A to point B. And that's kind of how history moves forward. I would have never known unless I had talked to Jane, and I would have never known if I had talked to Bill Gates. So that is exactly how history kind of transforms, and that's why it's important to share your stories. Talk. Let's get it back. All right. I might have to. Okay. So this is a fireplace at Abenia. The next photo shows another angle of that. Yep. And, in my mind, this is something you would see in a church or something, not necessarily your home, but the Gothic kind of architecture, art that kind of encompasses the entire aspect of it. Just how neat, how kind of interesting. This is Peabody's music room. This would be on the upper floor of the house. This was a Steinway piano. There's actually correspondence that Iphigene Ox had donated a Steinway piano to Yaddo also. I believe it to be the same one. But it just kind of shows in this era of like when he first came to Lake George, who he was, the financier, got to buy the stuff, And that changed over his lifetime. He very much left the, I think that's a polar bear rug and a tiger rug, He very much changed that mentality as he kind of got older and became more in tune with what he wanted to kind of do, which was give back. The library, this is same thing on the second story. Different paintings this is a reproduction of a Raphael painting. Just wonderful, the amount of artwork. Some of this right here and this right here, these are still at Yaddo. I was fortunate to tour Yaddo last year and as one of the public tours, and it's such an interesting thing to know what you're looking for and be like, whoa, hey, it's like go find it. There it is. But really, really interesting. So this would be the greenhouse at Abenia. And it's tough to imagine this because it's just never been there in this era. It's not clear to me if Peter Kiernan took it down or but I know that during the Ox family's ownership of Abenia, this is still very much in operation, still very much being used. And this, that gazebo, I believe was that there during Sunnybrook's? Yes. So as, that kind of lasted through the eras. But more or less a self-sustaining estate. There's Peabody himself at that same gazebo. Something I want in my yard. I mean, whew. But really interesting. And so this was more or less, I thought this was a great kind of testament to who he was locally. I've read different publications and, for me, it's reciting it. I've seen his weekly work, documented how many guys did this, how many guys did that. It was an operation. I've read on upwards of 100 people that he employed, just in his direct employment in Lake George. And so, this, if you haven't, read it, he recalls that basically, hey, my workers have wives, my workers have lives. Let me cut the workday down an hour. Let me make it so it's not so taxing and troubling on your families. And he was very much a part of that. I've also read documentation where he would very much embrace, if you were a really good worker, he would really kind of bring you up. And if you didn't do that, if you were kind of the opposite, he wouldn't punish you, he just wouldn't necessarily help you as much. And we're talking about giving, he would give like favorable loans to some of his workers to actually purchase their own homes. Different aspects of their lives where, he could just help them in that way. And I thought that was wonderful. One of the more interesting things is, so this is his gardener, this is John Peterson was his name. And this is something that, man, I've never read this. So John Peterson, more or less, Peabody employs him, makes him his number one guy. Hey, Peterson, I like this tree, planted at Abenia, and really a lot of that stuff. This, I thought, was the most interesting thing that I've ever seen. Here's a patent from Mr. John Peterson, steering apparatus for ships. And what I've come to realize is this is more or less a compass that makes and breaks a circuit, and your boat essentially steers left or right, based on the operation of this compass. This is one of the first versions of autopilot to ever exist. And there's autopilot patents that document this, reference this. And it's unclear to me if, Peterson is sitting there tinkering around and comes up with it, or if it's Peabody's affiliation with maybe GE or something and says, hey, Peterson, let's buy that patent for you, and, it'll be a way for you to make money. Either which way, this I thought was like a smoking gun of how, just what Abenia was. It's a creative hub. It's a place where, even the guy that's just a gardener, just kind of like a lower guy, Peabody brings him into his circle and says, hey, you're not the lower guy anymore, you're the guy. And here's John Peterson that's directly responsible for replanting half of the Saratoga Spa State Park. As the Saratoga Reservation Commission was formed, here you have John Peterson in charge of those parks. And that's all related to protecting and saving the waters of Saratoga, but also establishing the High Rock Park, reestablishing the Congress Park, the entire Geyser Park. Here's John Peterson that's directly part of that. This is the guy that planted the Avenue of Pines in Saratoga. And so it's really, it's wild to me just what this is for the world, and what, what's autopilot? No big deal, huh? Yeah, okay. So yet another one, and this is where it kind of segues into what Lake George was. Here's a letter that John Peterson wrote to Peabody, or actually he wrote to L.G. Myers, Peabody's secretary, but it's more or less like, correspondence saying, hey, we have a situation. We have a guy that quit in the greenhouse, but we have this other guy that we can make him a something, I think he's good. This guy's name was Emil Strand, right? And basically, as it, the entire letter, obviously it's a lot to read, but more or less, Peterson says, I think there's something here. I think we can give him a higher wage, we can work him more, and he'll work out. Emil Strand was more or less a large part of, as the Lake George Club, as Peabody, Spencer Trask, Bigsby, some of these local millionaires are sitting around saying, hey, we need a place for us to go in the summertime. We need a little club. The Lake George Club itself, here's Emil Strand. As they're doing it, Peabody purchases the land for the Lake George Club, like himself. They're organizing it. He purchases it. They kind of install Emil Strand, put in charge of removing old buildings on the property and making way for the new clubhouse. And Strand became the superintendent and manager of the Lake George Club and worked there for 54 years until he retired. And it's been said that they still plant like white petunias kind of in memory of Strand. So here's a guy that's just, he's just like a lonely greenhouse worker. Here's the entire Peabody Peterson operation, lifting someone up, empowering them and saying, hey, you're something, And so here you have Emil Strand with an absolute purpose. There's an early photograph of the Lake George Club. And so kind of dealing with Abenia, there's another guy, John, so his name would be James Paul. And so James Paul, a superintendent of Peabody's, a former driver of his horses and this and that, more or less a highly employed guy. Peabody really respected Paul. James Paul cut a bunch of bridle paths all through what's now Hearthstone Point, but he also, after Peabody's purchase of Prospect Mountain, they would maintain the Big Hollow Road, but he would also, employ Paul and his men to kind of like keep those things going. So from Abenia, we're talking about, I believe it was about 350 plus acres of property. It would go all the way from what Lakeshore Drive cuts it in half in the lake, so right where it'd be like the lodges at Crest Haven or the Twin Birches Lakefront, all the way up, you cross the road, but then it pushes all the way back, Middle Road, Flat Rock Road, all the way out to what was called Lookout Mountain. And this is something like during the Sunnybrook era, there's horseback riding that goes all the way up. It's very much like as he's in Lake George, as Peabody's in Lake George, he made it his place, cuts all these wild bridle paths all through everything. And a lot of the lower part of that did become Hearthstone Point. And so here's interesting, this is the Price Manor Boathouse. I read it's a Stoddard documentation where he basically says, this is not a lighthouse, you know. And I was like, oh, okay. I wonder what that looks like. And somewhere in the museum, I've seen it before, there's actually a better photograph of this. But you know, this is the lakefront as it was in 1898 to 1899 in that winter. You know, after Peabody's purchase, he built the Abenia Boathouse. This would be the Boathouse restaurant today. You know, obviously the lakeshore looks a bit different now. This photograph is from Adolph Ox's era of Abenia's ownership. And here you have George Foster Peabody's, they called it a launch. So this is his boat. And I mentioned earlier, you know, there's many documentation that would say he's a community guy. So not only did he, you know, shuttle and escort different people up and down the lake and this and that, I've read things where he'd pick people up to go to Sunday Mass, you know, just kind of like right down the lake. There's a great story in my book about how him and his brother actually saved a child's life on the lake, you know, with their boat and this and that. Here's a guy that just loved Lake George, was always out and about, but he's very giving with his boat too. And you know, I don't have the time to go into the full history of what the Pocahontas was, but that is in my book. But also it's something that he was very giving, and his boat captain, coincidentally his name is Charles Smith Wood, but Charles Wood, he would essentially say, all right, hey, you know, go here, do this, go here, do this. Hey, this guy needs a ride, you know. And so he was very giving with what he had. I can talk about that a little bit later. This is the Pocahontas from a regatta day. You know, they would decorate it in flowers and kind of like do a boat parade. I thought that was really interesting. So now just to go through kind of affiliated houses of the Millionaires Row. So here's a photograph of Abenia. You know, so that's Peabody's himself. Next you have Everly. This would be as you know, which you all have maybe seen, but as you come down the Northway, it's right there, owned by Don Konsikowski. You know, this is often in history it'll say this is the lower price place. This is the lower price manor. You know, I found documentation where the original lower price place, which was Walter Price's son, it had actually burned to the ground in the early 1900s. It was completely rebuilt. You know, the exact date is off the top of my mind, but it's like I believe it's like 1911 or 1913. But you know, in that Tudor style. But this is Peabody brother Charles, and more or less like those brothers made Lake George their home. So you had George at Abenia, you had Charles at Everly, you had his brother Royal at Wikiosco. So this would be the Blenheim on the lake, you know, privately owned now. They all, it's like one and the same. Like, hey, what are you doing today? I'll go down to your house. You come up to mine. And so there's a lot of evidence of just like, what's mine is yours. You know, George would employ his men and say, all right, send 5 guys down to Wikiosco and they're going to do your landscaping today. No big deal. You know, like it's just, they very much shared in their Lake George experience. Then you have West Meadow, which is a brother house to Earl West. And basically, you know, this is Charles Shepard. This is Edward Moore Shepard. So these two brothers basically, you know, and there's a sister also, Agnes. And more or less like, you know, you've heard of Earl West, but what, you know, there's so many subtle things that these people have done for our community. When Edward Moore Shepard died, actually, Charles Shepard had purchased, we're talking about St. James Episcopal, had contributed towards the organ. You know, here's Edward Moore Shepard that in my book, you know, I realize he's part of, it's called the Sargent Commission, which was an early commission from New York State that basically laid out what the forest preserve should be, what the Adirondacks and the Catskills should be. And I'd never read his name attached to any of this. I had documented it. It is in my book. Edward Shepard, as part of this sergeant commission, they literally, in their language, wrote the words, these public lands shall be kept forever wild. So when you hear about the Adirondacks in here, forever wild, this is language that the sergeant commission, came up with. This was Edward Moore Shepard that's part of this. And this is, just beyond us, this is Shepard Park, which I'll talk about. You have Triuno, which is Spencer and Katrina Trask's house up in Bolton Landing. They took 3 islands and put them together, built their estate there. Secondary to Yaddo, this also became a place where artists would go and, writers would go for a very short window of time in the I believe it might be the 1920s. I'm not sure if it went into the 30s, but it was also used as a retreat of sorts. So this is Minantio. This is Peabody's cottage. After he sold Abenia, he had actually already owned this, but this was more or less, this was the left side of the Hill of Happiness. This was Peabody's Lake George cottage after, post Abenia. He would come here, he would spend summers here still. He never officially left Lake George, if that makes sense. He did move to Saratoga circa 1914, but always remained in touch, remained very present in the activities of what we have going on, in the town and the village. So Prospect Mountain is an interesting thing. Now, I've accounted for a lot of the history of it in my book relating to Peabody. There's also a local historian, John Sasso. I posted it online. I have a Facebook group, but John Sasso created the entire history of Prospect Mountain from the beginning to the end. It's a free publication. It's online. And what's really interesting is, what it is, and there's a lot of tales and mistales, but here's what I will say from the perspective of Peabody. We all know it well. Here's a letter. This is 1905. This is from Edwin Warden, and it basically says, "Hey, George, I think you can buy this mountain for me." But what it actually says is, "Hey, it could be purchased for a certain sum of money." We've heard a lot of tall tales about, we don't want to buy it because there's somebody that's going to put a casino up there. Or what I can confirm is that he didn't want somebody of ill nature to buy it. He didn't want something that wasn't for the people up there. And, Warden's letter comes to Peabody, and it's obvious through history that Peabody was actionable about the purchase of Prospect Mountain. 1905, George bought the mountain. And so there is a bit of a misconception, but what I will say is he bought the entire Otis elevator operation all the way up, and he bought the entire summit. There's parts of that mountain that have since, been added, but there's a second part of it. This is not New York State Forest Preserve. This is for public recreation. This is absolutely, what Peabody intended was a place that people could go, and actually I've read correspondence where he really wanted to make Lake George the hub, the bustling place, And so he believed that with that lookout, by being high and looking across, the 50-mile view, people would flock to the place and see it. And so, this is pre-Peabody purchase, but this is your Prospect Mountain house. This is a bit of the railroad operation, but that's obviously, looking down at the lake. This is not Peabody on Prospect Mountain that I can confirm, but that's our man in some hiking boots. And what I thought was really interesting. So this would be it has to be 1926 to probably 1936, that 10-year window. I can't confirm the date because it's not on the back of this photograph, but I thought this was another really interesting picture of the time where it shows, Peabody with his adopted daughter, Marjorie, and they're out for a hike, and I thought it was really it was interesting to see like the attire of the day and what his version of hiking is. It's not North Face and Patagonia. It's it's the old school, but I really appreciate just the same thing. Like I said earlier, here's the dynamic of him. This big financier, this big giant character, doing the same things that we all would love to do. Like just breathe in the fresh air of upstate New York, of Lake George. So these are some photographs of the actual operation of the incline rail. Peabody purchased the entire operation, so the trussels were there, although deteriorating. And over his ownership, which is from 1905 to 1925, they had almost completely deteriorated. I've read documents where the local kids would, it's almost like it's the movie Stand By Me, where they're walking down the railroad and they would dare each other to walk the trussels and stuff like that. And there's some injuries that happen for sure, but through my research, I've never been able to come up with, did the rails get sold as scrap metal? There's a lot of publications that'll say Peabody sold them for the war effort. They were steel. But I do know that during his operation, during his ownership, he never actually took Prospect Mountain, and he tried it multiple times. He never got the railroading, the incline rail up and running again. So this is a Stoddard photograph from the Adirondack experience, and I just thought that was really interesting to see where the trestle kind of comes up and ends. When they say incline, that's incline. And there you have the Prospect Mountain house. This would be fire observer. His name was Arthur Irish. You can kind of see the disrepair of the Prospect Mountain house, but you could also see how they built it up at the top as a fire observation. This kind of went to the wayside as they put in a fire tower. And once again, I've read correspondence, I've read documents where people, and then there's publications that say this building burned, and then it burned. What I believe, what I've come to know through documents, is it was actually raised also. There was not a great fire that burned this down at the top of Prospect Mountain, although there have been fires on Prospect Mountain that have affected, this and that. A bit about the history of how it came to be, because this is also what relates to all of us. Here's a guy that owns the mountain and says, welcome, go on up, That can only last for so long in our lifetimes. How does it maintain post-Peabody? Now the New York State Park System, it was only forever wildlands, before this. We're talking 1923. Peabody says, hey, you know what? I want New York State to have Prospect Mountain. I want it to be public land. I want it to be state land. What can we do about this? And the state says, nah, we're not taking it, And there's multiple places, multiple aspects of Lake George. Diamond Island is another one where, simply put, they would not take it because they just didn't have a developed pathway to take it yet. I believe through reading that Peabody used Prospect Mountain as kind of a bargaining chip for the preservation of the Tongue Mountain Range as that was being sold to the state and kind of figured out, and the Lake George, we'll call it park, was expanding. Peabody said, hey, you know what? If you guys do, make no mistake, Al Smith is the governor. Peabody is very affiliated with him. Robert Moses is the commissioner of the parks. Kind of an interesting character. There's some goods, there's some bad, there's some real bad. But what I would say is these people are on the same commissions. They're in the same circles. They have a general understanding of business together or civics together. And Peabody kind of parlays. He says, hey, I'll give the state Prospect if you guys do the Tongue Mountain thing. And, there's an interesting story. Ellen Apperson Brown writes about it in her book. I read about it in my book. it's really interesting how Peabody and we'll say conservationist John Apperson kind of like went up to bat during this era for the Lake George Park. But yeah, so September 21st, 1925, the New York State Conservation Commission announced that it officially accepted the deed, and that's state ownership. 100-year anniversary was last year. That's also the same week that I announced my book and put it out. So kind of timing that matches. That's exactly what I wanted to do. So to talk about Hearthstone Point, more or less, he envisioned it. You have a lot of, like I said earlier, his bridle paths that kind of go through it. Peabody started the fire that became Hearthstone. He did sell the land to New York State. It wasn't donated, but he did sell it for more or less pennies on the dollar. It's one of these things where, you know, he could have churned a pretty good profit for the amount of acreage right on the lake at that spot, and decided that he didn't, you know, it should be public park. You know, there's a reinsurance salesman, what would his name be? I don't even know if I actually included it. Yep. So, yeah, Carl Schreiner. So more or less Schreiner, he sold 2 parcels, and then George's nephew basically sold the other parcels. So 4 main parcels came together, made the actual park itself. You know, on we'll call it the Bolton Road or Lakeshore Drive. I mean, this is the public campground. You know, this is it, and that was it. Did not exist before that. So I've read different stories. You know, I included one in my book where we're talking about, you know, Peabody and company. They're on a boat ride on the Pocahontas, and his boat captain, you know, he's driving the boat, and somebody says, "Hey, look at that ugly stripe that's going up by Hearthstone. What is that? What's that stupid road?" And Peabody says, "Oh yeah, we should probably do something about that." And his boat captain says, "Well, you know, nah." George says, "What?" And the guy says, "Well, you gotta understand, that strip of land, that's for the people. And you know, all the millionaires have bought all the property, but the locals have that little strip of land to go down to the lake." And back then, it's which I don't know if it's still true or not now, but you do see it about 1 mile everywhere up. You have a public access point, and Hearthstone is one of them. And so Peabody says, you know, agrees with his boat captain. He's like, "Yeah, we're not going to tell the conservation commissioner or anything like that. We're just gonna, we'll brush that one under the rug. This is for the people, you know." And so once again, another example of Peabody saying, "Hey, you know, you're not just my boat captain. Get to work." He's saying, "You're part of my world. You know, I value what you're saying." So Diamond Island. Here you have, I took this photograph. It's of the Diamond Island Peace Stone. This thing is huge. I have another photograph where I think I stand about this tall next to it. I believe it's about 13 feet tall in total. So this is an operation where basically George Foster Peabody buys the property. He buys the land. He bought it from Caroline Price Payne, which was Walter Price's daughter. If you remember, like Peabody was familiar with, you know, the Price Manor property and all of that. Edward Moore Shepard bought the Earl of West property from Caroline Price Payne. And so these guys kind of had a general understanding of who owned it, right? They buy the property. Peabody gifts it to Katrina Trask. There's a really, you know, it's in Bill Gates' Millionaire's Rowbook, and I put it in my book too. Very, very just whimsical boat ride where Peabody gives Katrina the deed, and it's just this wonderful exchange. But between George Foster Peabody, Spencer Katrina Trask, Edward Moore Shepard, and their greater families, and there are others. I mean, this is a village. They wanted this island to be remembered in the name of peace. They said, you know, a lot of conflict happened, a lot of wars happened, and this and that. We want this island to be remembered for peace. And so what they did, and this is also another one of those, like, what does history say versus what does the facts say? So up in Warrensburg, this would be on Route 9 across from, I guess it'd be the Judd Bridge. This giant balancing rock. In some newspapers, they call it Gibraltar, but generally they call it the High Rock. This was right on the side of what's present-day Route 9. And so what's very clear is that through documents, this exact rock, they blasted out a bit of that and created that. And so when you'll read in history, it'll say, from the lofty heights of Prospect Mountain, they dragged it right on down. And I said, wow, that's great. And then I found an article from the early 1900s that maybe disproves that. And then multiple articles that say, it's from Warrensburg. It's from Warrensburg, And so that's another thing that's interesting about history is like, nobody could possibly know it all. It's just what evidence you've seen and how you interpret it. And so, the evidence of that exact monument coming from the High Rock is very strong. Now, the second part is there used to be a blockhouse that sat up the hill, from where this is. And so they thought in their mind, hey, this rock has seen all the conflict. Everyone passes by. The blockhouse saw the troops, saw this, saw that. And, almost like taking what that is and saying, you know what? But it's going to see peace from now on. We're going to create the peace monument. And so really interesting. They had a dedication ceremony. They opened the island up to the public. It's absolutely a public place. It's a picnic island. You could take your boat there. You can swim there, but it's pretty far. But in all reality, these are the exact type of people that the Trasts and Peabodys were. To talk about Weowaka. So the Weowaka Center for Women still exists. It's the oldest women's retreat in the country. I think it's wonderful. And, I've had the privilege of talking to Doreen Kelly recently about it. I'm going to present there, later this summer. But what's really interesting is the connection that Peabody had to what he was about. So when it comes to Weowaka, Peabody and Spencer Trask actually purchased the land and once again, gave it to Katrina Trask. Here it is. And then Peabody sent his men there and said, all right, here's your weekly work. You're going to be doing this. You're going to be doing that. And so, I know it's a lot of wording, but basically they would take care of the grounds. They would cut the trees and cut hay. They would fill the sawdust in the ice house. These are things that just need to be done. And Peabody's men that are under his employ, he's just sending them there. And they're basically, actively contributing. He's always a friend to Weowaka, more or less on an advisory committee type of position, all the way through. It's something he deeply cared about. It's something that never changed. Here's another example I talked about earlier, his boat, the Pocahontas. This is something where Peabody would basically say, all right, well, the workers, the working women of the factories are coming to stay at Lake George for the week, right? Well, let's give them something, Send the Pocahontas over. We're going to give them a tour around the lake. And so Captain Wood would take the Pocahontas. He'd pick the girls up from Weowaka, and they'd do a little boat tour, almost like as if you were going on the Minnehaha or something like that. And then that would kind of conclude with a picnic at Diamond Island, which also falls right into what they did, And there's some fun correspondence that, that I've read and this and that, but what I really appreciated was like, just how much of the experience that whoever is going, I don't know if anyone can remember the first time they've seen Lake George, or consciously remember it, but it's like we live in such a beautiful place that a lot of people just have never seen what this is in such beauty. But there's so many people that come here that never even get out on the lake. That's another big part of it. So to open up that door and not just say, hey, we're on the land, they're on the lake. And he opened up that for them, by use of his boat. So I thought that was pretty wonderful. This was interesting. So Georgia O'Keeffe came to Weowaka, more or less and that history, you can find it online. it's very awesome. You know, as a young painter, she basically won a contest, came up to Lake George, and essentially what I thought was most interesting is, at her stay at what was then, Wakanda Lodge or Amatola of Wiawaka, they more or less had an art show at the end of the week. And, it says, next week, the paintings will be exhibited at the Boathouse of George Foster Peabody. And I thought that was really interesting because it's like, hey, it's George O'Keeffe. That's pretty prominent. That's pretty wild. And then to think about what it is, was one of her paintings shown at the Boathouse? I'm not sure. I haven't found that documentation. But what I can say is the fact that it was even offered, the fact that that was a connective thing, I think that's just wonderful. Supporting the arts and also like using Abenia and using his resources not as just like, hey, it's just mine. This isn't yours, it's mine. I thought that was really a really awesome thing. And so more or less the history that I just talked about. But yep, that's exactly what I just said. So a brief part on the St. James Episcopal Church. Like I said, when George Foster Peabody came to Lake George, he made it his own. He absolutely involved himself with the local community. He joined the St. James Episcopal Church as if it was his church. This is one of those things where I thought this was really interesting. So after George Foster Peabody actually passed away, you have Edward M. Parrott. So if you look right here, it'll say, besides having been instrumental in inducing the present rector to accept this charge, the rector, so basically Peabody is responsible for Parrott coming to Lake George in a way. He was a big part of St. James, donated multiple stained glass windows. As I was talking earlier, there's a lot of history to that. And one of the bigger pictures is that like, it would be, I know from my mind, there's a girl that passed away on Lakeshore Drive in front of Abenia. And George Foster, in a car accident. I believe her name was Gertrude Mordecai or something like this. And, kind of a wild event. Peabody says, you know what, like, this is horrible, but I'm gonna pay for a stained glass window. We're gonna put it at St. James. And there's these acts of giving where, like, from what I've seen, it's everything. It's not just like, here's $10. I mean, he'll go through and donate more and more and more. And not only that, but say like, I thought this was really cool. A parish hall for the congregation, designed by Peabody's nephew. Peabody contributed by personally paying the expense to deepen the basement of the building. His intention was to make the basement suitable for a gymnasium. That's what was said back then. Spencer Trask also aided financially to the construction of the parish hall. This building was called Tuttle Hall and formally opened on August 10th, 1909. And that's still there. And so like anything, just a couple of guys that say, it's happening, This is our giving. Yet another, public roads. This is between what would be the Lake George Steamboat Company, I don't know if you call it office or building, and the Fort William Henry Hotel. George Foster Peabody paid the majority for a road that connected them. So from the train station to the hotel, he basically had the road rebuilt. And this is nothing out of the ordinary. There's so much correspondence where he's talking to town supervisors or village mayor, or saying like, hey, you're the highways, New York State Highway. Hey, this road is bad. We need to do something about this. Hey, you're trying to widen the road. Hey, we don't want, And he would go through and give his input on every little thing, but also he would make a lot of decisions, as they were debating on whether the trolley, that used to be in the village would be taking out. It's like Peabody's a part of that. There's correspondence of that. And so, here's not only a guy that's building private roads for himself, for his horses, and for the public to go up Prospect Mountain. here's a guy that's paying for roads. It's Beach Road. I mean, I guess it's Beach Road. And so, in a way, you know, in 1906, here's a guy that says, it's not just my house up here. This is my place. I am a citizen of here. You know. So your public library. This is a really interesting, maybe understated thing. So as they're you know, and I put all the library history in my book also because I think it's really interesting. There's multiple collections that kind of came together, but they weren't necessarily housed in an accessible location. Right around that 1905, there's kind of a movement, and it says, "Hey, people from the village, give, and subscribe to the library, and then we can build it." Right. So by the spring of 1905, 191 people had subscribed to the cause, and you know, that's quite a bit of money for back then, $1,444. On March 29th of 1905, you know, I've seen correspondence with James Hayden and Peabody. I strongly feel that we must somehow or another see the thing through, all of us together on a proper basis. And so it's it's an unseen hand. You know, Peabody comes in and says, this must happen, right? You know, and in 1906, the Library Funding Committee announced that they had received $5,500. I mean, that's a matter of a year, and they raised another $4,000. I mean, that's pretty significant, especially for here. If it takes 191 people to come up with that, where did the $4,000 come from? And in my mind, there's a pretty clear answer. And even through correspondence that he had with Hayden in his letter, it was kind of cryptic a little bit. He was like, well, I could give a little subscription, but almost like if it was modern times, it'd be like, if they only knew what I'm actually going to give. You know, so it's very much one of those things where he didn't want his name on. It's not the George Foster Peabody this, the George Foster Peabody that. That's not his MO. That's not what he was about. It was the subtle gift. It was giving like behind it all. And so like anything, one year they raised the $4,000. And I thought this was interesting to know. Later, principal donors were listed as George Foster Peabody, Edward Moore Shepard, and James Hayden. I've also seen documentation where Edward Shepard Hewitt, which would be Edward Moore Shepard's nephew, he's the architect of the high school. He's the architect of the library. It's not plans, but he drew together a little sketch, sent it to Peabody, and said, "Hey, what do you think?" And I think that's the level of what was going on in that era. So a subtle, I'd say a subtle thing Peabody did. So more or less, he involved himself. 1910. He was credited by the Battleground Park Committee for helping pass a bill that supplied funding to improve the park by erecting a fence around the French Indian War Monument. As you can see in that era, it's some maybe barbed wire, and now, I mean, this still stands as it is today. The bill also established funding for walking paths around the park and restoration of the land with brush removal and landscaping. And then he's listed as part of the Battleground Park Committee, with long-standing members. So, James A. Holden, Edwin Seeley. So this is something where, I don't know if he opened his checkbook to get things happen, but he used his influence to get things done. And, whether it's lobbying the right people or whether it's just a phone call or a letter, there's a lot of movement, and maybe that's subtle. Maybe this is something where, I drive past that, who cares? It's not, if it was still this, or if you had nothing, what would that look like, So those little subtleties, and there's probably 200 more that I couldn't possibly even know. There's probably all of these things that you just can't imagine. But they're right under our nose. Where are they? I don't know. So we'll talk about Shepard Park. So here, I've talked about Edward Shepard a little bit. He died in 1911. They said it's pneumonia. Peabody was right at his bedside when he passed away. This is more or less his best friend. This is who brought him to Lake George initially. It very much, it hurt a lot. And within a 2-year span, Peabody also lost Spencer Trask. So you got to figure his two of his best friends are now passed away. And George Foster Peabody was a guy who memorialized his friends. He was somebody who really was passionate about what he was passionate about. And so it's said many times, Edward Moore Shepard had talked about maybe buying the old lake house grounds. If you look at old photographs, it kind of already is a park. It kind of already had this nice look to it, but it wasn't public. And they say in life, Edward Moore Shepard talked about that as if it should be a public park. In July of 1912, George Foster Peabody met with New York State Governor John Alden Dix to discuss establishing a park in the village of Lake George in memory of their mutual friend, Edward Moore Shepard. So this meeting was more or less, hey, we want to do this park. How are we going to fund it? Should it be a state park? Should it be not? And as I said earlier, state recreation parks weren't really necessarily a giant thing. They weren't a thing, actually, especially not in 1912. And so, why, the second question is, why would the state own the land that's in Caldwell at the time? And then the second part is, how do we fund it, right? And so ultimately, instead of asking for or accepting money from New York State, Shepard's friends, basically his brothers, his friends group, and other members of the community, especially with Katrina Trask kind of leading the charge on a pageant, they came up with a plan. And to raise the money, Friends of Shepard organized a large pageant production. The pageant focused on the full history of Lake George throughout its years, which is something that Edward himself was very fond of while he was still alive. In August of 1912, the streets of Lake George were decorated with flags and banners displaying the pageant week theme. On August 30th, 1912, the opening of the Spirit of the Pines Lake George pageant was held. There were 3 showings of the pageant, and they were all dedicated towards raising money for the park itself. This is how the park was primarily funded. And the exact amount, I haven't seen the document that shows who paid what, who has done this, but there's box seats, and they're kind of like, the lower spot, right? And it's Peabody, it's his brothers, it's his family, it's his friends. And so more or less, overall, the pageant was a major success. The village was buzzing with excitement as the pageant entertained and educated the crowds. The Peabody brothers, box seat holders, and other citizens of Lake George pooled their money together, and $11,200 was raised. As seen by the library and what the subscriptions were to that, you can realize how much they wanted Shepard Park to happen. And certainly they did pay for it. They pooled their money together and made it happen. And so the original design was from Edward's nephew, Edward Shepard Hewitt. And actually and so I'll move forward. And so this is the initial dedication ceremony. And I thought this is like, wow, I have a keen eye, because I'm looking at it, and George Foster Peabody sitting back here, but as you zoom in, it's like, well, there he is, and the photograph is only this big, so I was like, wow, there he is. But very much as it's dedicated, they read a giant poem. I included the poem in my book. It's just a very nice tribute to Shepard himself. Also in the appendix of my book, I spent, it was maybe 3 or 4 months trying to figure out where the columns actually went and where could they possibly be. And it's, at this point, still it's a dead end. But what I realized is that a lot of it was replaced in the 1950s. 1957, I believe, there's an effort to change them out, more or less because they were deteriorating as tourists and people alike come up and, let me just take let me write my name on it or chip a little piece off of it. They tried to fix it with different concrete type of materials, and it wasn't looking too pretty. It's unclear to me where the top stones actually went or anything of the sorts, but this was your Shepard Park amphitheater as it was first built. And everyone has an opinion on this or that. I love what they're doing there right now. I think it's wonderful. I think it's such a beneficial thing that we have in our village. And I think like anything, the foundational part of that, is these people cared. They decided we should have this, And if you go to, let's just say, a lot of tourist places, imagine if we didn't have that and it's just two businesses, 2 rows of businesses, no park. It's like, yeah, that's interesting, but we have all the commerce and all the shops and all the, all the little stores. But you could sit there and read a book right outside and not be bugged by anybody. I mean, it's something that public places are important, and these people absolutely believe that. And it's kind of a testament, Peabody and Company. So the Forest Preserve Association, Peabody affiliated as a later man in life, affiliated himself with, this is Irving Langmuir. He was more or less a GE engineer. He's I'm going to call him he's a Nobel laureate, I think you'd call it. Very intelligent, people. This guy did, cloud seeding experiments. He did very, very high level stuff. And Peabody more or less affiliated himself with John Apperson, Irving Langmuir, all conservationists thinking about the future, thinking about what Lake George is, what's happening in the present, where's it going to lead. And this is interesting. In 1934, the Forest Preserve Association of New York provided the funding for the United States Soil Conservation Service to publish 40,000 copies of an educational pamphlet entitled The Truth About Erosion, Tragic Truth About Erosion. And so there's many, Ellen Apperson Brown wrote a perfect book on John Apperson. It talks about, the erosion of even Lake George and the changing water levels, how they're rip-rapping certain islands and really caring about the ecology of the lake. And, someone had asked me, hey, do you think Peabody was out there rip-rapping islands? And I was like, I don't know. I haven't seen it, but you also have to figure, in this era, he's an 82-year-old man. He's an older guy, but still cares. This is still him in Lake George caring. This is interesting. I found this. March 23rd, 1923, George Foster Peabody to William K. Bixby. I do hope that it may be possible for the state to acquire Dome Island. I confess between ourselves that I wish our conservation commissioner were somewhat more keen and energetic in his progress towards the consummation of the state's wise projects at Lake George. As in, that state needs to buy Dome Island, please, And this is something that John Apperson actually made happen, years later. But this is something that, how forward-thinking are most people? How beautiful is Dome Island? What would it look like if there was just a big giant house on it or whatever, This is foresight. So kind of coming towards the end, French Point. So after George Foster Peabody had passed away, they said in life, in the Dome Island aspect, that's an example, a taste of what he was thinking. He was thinking, hey, Tongue Mountain, there really shouldn't be houses and monstrosities or a big highway that runs up it. What can we do? Let's preserve it. Dome Island, that should be part of all of this, And so with that Tongue Mountain preservation, after George Foster Peabody passed away, John Apperson led an effort to basically purchase land on Tongue Mountain. It's French Point. If you're familiar with the lake, as you're going north, it's on your left-hand side. And there was we'll say a women's summer camp for the GE workers. That was established around the 1920s. That closed down, and actually Apperson led this effort to get subscriptions to pay for the land. And so, scroll a little bit. So this is a Stoddard photo. This is 1889. This is pre-camp and all that, but you can see a little crib dock right here. And that's kind of where the point is. These are the Dollar Islands. People jump off them in the summertime. There's kind of like a little cove on the other side. And so right about here or so, and I'll go back one, as people are subscribing to the movement of purchasing, French Point itself, we'll say this: when I first started, I'm not familiar with every name that's on every document, but looking at who subscribed, John Apperson is up top, John Howard Mellish, George Foster Peabody's adopted daughter Marjorie Waite. But then you have Mrs. Andrew Carnegie, $300. John D. Rockefeller Jr., I believe it's $300 or $250. Maurice Hoops, this is Finch Prine, Governor Lehman. You go down the line and it's like, Bernard Baruch, a statesman. You're talking about pretty prominent people, Iphigene and Arthur Salzburger, and they're giving. It's the same in his spirit. They're giving to kind of accomplish, what it is. Now, on French Point itself, this is the monument that's there. And actually, if I had to guess, that might be larger than actual size, but it's pretty close to actual size. Here you have a picture of John Apperson with the memorial. This is the only monument or memorial in Lake George for George Foster Peabody, besides the relics of what he left, or kind of like. And when I first started thinking about it, I said, this is it, And if you see it nowadays, it's behind all the trees. You're on the lake, and it's hard to find. You have to get off your boat, paddle into the island and kind of walk through the trees around. And this is a photograph that I took of it. It's mossy. It's older. But I thought, I didn't stew on it, but I thought quite a bit about it. Is this enough? Is it? Should there be something more for the guy? And the more that I thought about it, the more I kind of realized, well, anybody can say that. Where's the effort? So my effort starts with this, and I think like anything, it's not a monument, but it's a testament. And I think like the second part is we have the monuments. There's just not a statue. We have Shepard Park. We have Prospect Mountain still. We have these things that are still there from him. And I think that's really important and kind of, the question is, do you need a statue to know? But like, when there's a statue, people say, oh, who's that? Or if something's named after. If it was Peabody Park, you might say something different. But because these public places are still here, that's a testament in itself. That is the monument. That's what I believe. But I also think, the knowing and understanding of who he was is pretty important. And there's so much. I mean, it would take me 2 lifetimes to write 20 books about every aspect of his life. But I think it really is. It really is kind of that. And so that basically concludes it. And boom.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to let everyone know that we are live streaming it and recording it for later. So I'm going to put together a microphone so that if you have questions, just raise your hand and we'll come around with the mic. Okay.
And so I'm probably shyer than you. If anybody has any thoughts or questions or anything to add, or if you know something about him or you've seen something, ask away. It's not a. I'm a student of history just like anybody else is, and I think that the conversation is important. And if you don't have any questions, that's okay too.
I just want to say one thing.
Yep.
Fabulous. Learned so much. And I want to say thank you for creating a new Sunnybrook, for bringing forth your alliteration of this and actually restoring the fountain, restoring so many things that my husband's family, the Paul family, started after, and it looks fabulous. I'm really proud of it. I wish you could have talked to my mother-in-law about it.
Yep.
Yeah, it's great. Can't wait to read your book.
Oh, thank you. And Pat Baker. So, my father-in-law, my mother-in-law, my wife, very good friends with her, and this is what community is too. It's not everybody knows everything, and like you said, embracing the past and pushing forward the future is kind of part of it. And thank you. I appreciate that.
Do you know where in Brooklyn that he and his family lived?
Is Brooklyn Heights, I believe.
Brooklyn Heights. Okay.
So the church would be it was called the Reformed Church on the Heights, and streetwise, I probably have documentation of where it's written down.
Okay.
But more or
I'm
less.
curious about the YMCA that he went to. That seems pivotal.
Yeah. So, as far as I know, it doesn't exist anymore. And in my book, I found a photograph of the first YMCA. And more or less back then, we imagined maybe the one in Glens Falls, this big, separate building and this and that. Back then, it would be like, and this is the city, so there's so much going on. They would essentially carve out, here it is, So when they first started, it was more or less like, I think it was less basketball, more library, more, there's more things to do, there. But he really, I've seen so many, so many things that he said about self-education or the things that got him started. And, one of them, it really was. It was, he'd get out of work, he'd go to the YMCA, and he would just sit there and he would learn. And I think after, later in life, that's why he involves himself so much in that, that cause, to build them, to kind of give back. And he did receive honorary degrees, one from Harvard. It's funny because sometimes they'll say Dr. Peabody, and I'm like, that's really awesome, Or they'll say his friends called him Foster, For me, as the admirer, I always call him George Foster Peabody, the full name. But it's interesting because someone that's, it tells a lot too. You don't have to, college is wonderful for people. This man's path was homeschool, self-taught, pushed up, surrounded by college-educated people. And I think that's interesting too. He believed in taking authority for yourself and assuming it and just saying, hey, if you learn and you can accomplish also. And so I do think he was a big proponent of those causes. I've tried to find actual photographs of the YMCA to no avail. Yeah. Yep.
Cool.
Yep. Oh.
His mother's maiden name, it was Canfield, correct?
Yes.
Is it a relation to the Canfield Casino in Congress Park?
I don't believe so, no.
Okay.
No, I don't believe so. So I've made genealogy on Ancestry.com for his entire family and kind of traced it back. If it's affiliated, it might go up the chain and then back down to someone else, but it's not, it wasn't that he purchased it and named it. It's a totally different spur. It's different, yep. But he is definitely affiliated with the Congress Park and a lot of what's there and what's happened there. The Spirit of Life Monument, the Katrina Trask Staircase, and I go at that in my book quite a bit, at length. But I don't believe so. But do you have a question?
I go to St. James, and the altar and the lectern were donated by George Foster Peabody, and they were evidently from Sing Sing. And I believe I've read that there were two Episcopal churches in Sing Sing, one maybe in the prison and one in the town, and I actually don't know which we have, but that was his. And the chalice that we still use, silver chalice, was donated by his wife, and I know there are other things that I actually can't remember right now.
Yeah, and that right there shows just how much community it is.
Yeah. And he was he was on the vestry, and I believe he was the warden, the head of the vestry also. So.
Yep, and that's exactly it. Somebody who cares and somebody that's saying, hey, I can contribute here. You know, and I think that's important. And even in the Episcopal Church, you know, I'd say like what I've done with my book is really honed in on who he was to Lake George and who he was to Saratoga. But I also think like who he was to, say, you know, politics or religion or every bit of every cause that I kind of went down through. It's like he was involved in so much, but also like took the time to say, hey, what could St. James use? How could I be better? How could we benefit this, you know? And there's so many things that I've thought of too, like I said, Edward Shepard Hewitt designed the high school, and he also designed the library, and he's showing Peabody, you know, ideas for the library, and the timeline for the high school kind of lines up in this way where I'm like, is this a tangent? But I don't know. Did he have anything to do with the design or anything, any sort of anything, you know? But that's what kind of drives me in thinking, because it's what I hope, hey, hot mic. What I hope more than anything is that someone reads the book and says, hey, you know, I've always looked at this and I've thought of that, but maybe that's something. They do a little research and it comes up. It doesn't even have to be Peabody, but just like find that shred of evidence that says, hey, my old house is cool, but what about this window, you know? And I think that when I started this project, I liked history, but I wasn't involved in any sort of it. I wasn't involved in researching or anything. But there's a big aspect of like the little lessons that it'll teach you, and you know who he was and how it kind of like changes your mind, and the little, you know, there's examples in there of just I don't know, bits of his genius, bits of his wit too. You know, it's fun stuff. But yeah, any.
I think this would be a great moment to segue to our portrait unveiling.
Oh, perfect. Hang on.